All right, back for a video on spinal cord, a little bit about spinal cord anatomy, and we're using that to discuss reflexes. Now, that's not to say all reflexes are spinal, as we'll see shortly. Before I start, I want to talk a little bit about what reflexes are. So reflexes are involuntary automatic responses to particular stimuli. And as I said, I'll categorize reflexes, which will sort of relate a lot about the diversity of reflex types, but they all revolve around a very simple principle, which is receptor input that gets typically integrated, although sometimes there's fairly linear processing, in other words, very little processing, but receptor input that gets converted into a motor response that is unconscious. And a lot of times these reflexes are protective. Things like a pain withdrawal reflex, if you think about sort of touching something hot or stepping on something sharp, right? You get this sort of automatic recoil, if you will. It's called a withdrawal reflex. And you don't have to think about it, not really, but not at all. You don't think of this. That doesn't involve cognition. It doesn't involve thinking about generating these motor responses. Now, having said that, it's easy to think about sort of skeletal muscle reflexes, right? That sort of pulling your hand off of something hot. But there are also visceral reflexes that help you regulate your blood pressure. There are reflexes, things like your pupillary constriction and dilation in response to low and high light levels. And so, right, so these can fall into a bunch of different categories. And again, all unconsciously processed and generated. And again, one of the things to keep in mind too is that a lot of people think of these reflexes as sort of like infrequent events, right? You don't touch something hot very many times a day or week or month even. But we want to put reflexes into in a category of more continual use. Yes, a withdrawal reflex from something painful might be relatively infrequent, but you have stretch reflexes in muscles that are continuously active. Your postural muscles keep you upright without you really thinking about contracting and generating tension in those muscles, muscles along your spinal column, muscles in your legs, that are sort of automatically activated by stretch. And so as you sort of lean back and forth, you stretch certain muscles, and those muscles contract in response, helping you maintain balance and stability while being upright. And so that's a continual effect of and usefulness of reflexes. Okay, so stimulus, response, and it's involuntary. I'll categorize them towards the end of this, but what I want to do now is sort of and again, as I said before, we'll focus on spinal reflexes. But remember, there are cranial reflexes as well. Think about cranial reflexes as reflexes associated with things happening in your head. The pupillary reflex would be a good example. Reflexes with regard to visual input, right? Somebody throws something at you and you sort of reflexively recoil and twist away, right? That's a reflex associated with input and at least input to through cranial nerves. The output can be through the spinal cord as well as through the brain centers, the brain stem, essentially. Okay, so let's look a little bit at this. And again, we looked at the reflex arc, so we kind of know the general flow of information, right? But so what I want to do now is just label a few more things and talk about a little bit more of the spinal cord anatomy. And so what I'll do over on the right is draw a cross section of the spinal cord, right? So this is a section right this way, and then we turn it and look at the end of the spinal cord. And you've probably seen this in lab. Try to be reasonably anatomically correct. And if you recall, so this would be anterior or ventral. That would be posterior or dorsal. Right, so that's back. This is front. And we have the little circle I drew there in the center is the central canal, right? So that's a cerebrospinal fluid filled space that runs the length of the spinal cord and actually is continuous with the ventricles of the brain. Let me further divvy this particular spinal cord section, right? And I can draw this as sort of like tapering off into the distance, right, with our channel running down there, right? Again, we've sort of transected it here and looking at the end of it. And again, in lab, you've probably learned a little bit about the white matter and the gray matter regions of the central nervous system. So I'm going to try and draw the sort of, looks a bit like a butterfly, the butterfly shape of the gray matter. And it looks a little bit different region by region within the spinal cord. Pretty much like that. And again, I don't have a lot of room for a lot of labels on an individual picture here. But so this is gray matter, and surrounding it would be the white matter tracks, right? And so I don't want to color it in because I'm going to draw some cells in there in a minute. I don't want to, have it be them be covered up by the shading I do for the gray matter. The big difference between white matter and gray matter has to do with what you find in it. And the white matter is essentially ascending and descending tracks. And those tracks it's kind of like a nerve, really, right? Bundles of information, bundles of axons carrying information either north to the brain or south from the brain into the spinal cord and then out to the target tissues, right? And so white matter is white largely because it's axons, and axons have a very small volume and a relatively large amount of membrane contained in them. And so they're that high proportion of lipid component, the membranes, and membranes are phospholipids, fats. And most lipids are, right, go look in your refrigerator, most lipids are sort of whitish or yellowish in color. And so the white matter looks white because of the high fat component of the cell membranes. Again, largely axons running in the spinal cord here, running north and south. And the same is true in the brain, right? The white matter and the gray matter regions are where information is being transmitted from one place to another through axons. The gray matter is where you find a higher density of cell bodies, right? So this is where information is being transmitted from cell to cell and information processing, right? Because that's where, again, in this scenario, EPSPs and IPSPs are being generated and integrated from that cell-to-cell connections that are occurring on the dendrites and somas of the neurons. And again, it depends on the structure of the neuron, whether the dendrites are on the soma, as we'll see in a moment. Okay, so we've got I'll label a couple of regions here. White matter tracks. Right, and then we've got our gray matter. And our gray matter, again, that would be any of these. Right, so you've got dorsal white matter and you've got lateral white matter column. They're called columns, but they're columns being a column. They contain individual tracks, meaning bundles of axons sort of carrying similar information from a particular region or to a particular region. And so you've got dorsal columns, you've got lateral columns, you've got ventral columns. Okay, we don't want to get too carried away with the anatomy here. We can identify the gray matter regions similarly, where we've got a dorsal horn, a lateral horn, and a ventral horn, right? And now what we're going to see, and as we've seen before, is these horns contain the cell bodies of particular types of information based upon the layout of how information comes into and comes out of the spinal cord. And so I'm going to give this a little color. let's have a sensory neuron out here. I'm going to have this axon come in. Right? Now you should identify that already as a sensory neuron, right? We talked about this before, where that's a unipolar neuron. This is our cell body, kind of in the, not necessarily the middle, but right, but not at one end or the other of the cell here. The free nerve endings are the dendrites that have been sort of, moved relative to where we saw them on a multipolar neuron. And so we can think of this as, and we have to sort of pick an example here. We can think of this as a pain receptor out here in our skin, right? And so let's use an example here where we're going to touch something hot, right? And so in response to damage or compression or lots of different types of input here, heat, we're going to generate, so stimulus, let's just have that as sort of a squiggly arrow here, right? Right, our stimulus comes in, our sensory neurons generate gated potentials in response to that, right? We have gated channels. In this case, it would be, if it was pain, it would be opened by certain chemicals that are released in response to tissue damage or released by other cells that could act on these nerve endings. They could be mechanically gated by the distortion that's caused, if we compress your fingertip or something like that. Temperature, like a high temperature, right? We could have a temperature gated channels. All of those would generate EPSPs, right? Excitatory postsynaptic potentials. Or in this case, they might not be postsynaptic because it's not from a neuron per se, but they would be excitatory potentials, right? And so we would get an excitatory potential here, and then remember, right there is the axon initial segment. And so if we reach threshold, right, and again, if it's a painful stimulus, we're probably going to reach threshold, all of a sudden we generate an action potential. Through electrotonic current, we open up more voltage-gated channels, we get another action potential. You've seen this before, right? And you get this sort of repeated generation of an action potential all along that axon, right? And our information, again, from another video, is coded in the frequency of those action potentials being generated. Right? And again, the conveyance of an action potential is called a nerve impulse. How rapidly we regenerate nerve impulses, the frequency of action potential generation, is how we code the information. Was it, a light tap on your arm, or was it a bee sting? Right? Two different types of input, but the frequency of action potential generation probably differ between the two magnitudes of those stimuli. Okay. Our sensory neuron is going to innervate synapse upon, usually, not always, but usually on an interneuron. So I'm going to put that cell body here. And that interneuron is going to synapse on a motor neuron. Looking for a new color here. That would be in the ventral or lateral horn. And now if it's skeletal muscle, it's going to be in the ventral horn. I'll lay that out for you in a second. Green's not too bright. Right? And so we've got our motor neurons, so let's label these. So our sensory neuron is running through the afferent division of the peripheral nervous system. This is our interneuron. Then we synapse with a motor neuron that's coming back, carrying information out. So information is going this way, and then it's going this way. And our motor neuron, label that, is carrying information, just to review here, carrying information through the efferent division of the peripheral nervous system, right? Central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. Now, what we can do here is we can cluster this together. In other words, axons don't run as single axons. They run in clumps of axons called nerves when they're in the periphery, right? Over here, they ran as white matter tracks or columns, right? That would be clusters of axons bundled together, running together. Here, there'd be nerves, right? And so we could sort of bundle these as you'll see what I'm doing here in a second, hopefully. Right, and again, so I've sort of drawn these axons now within the nerves within which they would exist. And so we have and again from lab, hopefully you remember, that is the dorsal root, right? It's dorsal, towards the back. Root, it's the root of the spinal nerve. Ganglion. A ganglion is a cluster of cell bodies outside the CNS, right? And so we've got a sensory ganglion located as within the dorsal root ganglion, right? This would be the ventral root, right? This is the dorsal root. Sorry, I don't have room to spell everything out here, right? So the dorsal root of the spinal nerve comes in. We get a dorsal root ganglion along that root and enters the the dorsal horn, right? So that's sensory input, interneuron over to our ventral gray horn, which is where we find somatic motor. So what's here in this lateral horn? Aha, well that is visceral motor neurons, right? And again, we're not showing you a visceral motor reflex here, and so we don't have in other words, we'd have to redraw this guy over here, right? Because that's where the cell bodies are found if these are motor neurons controlling things like cardiac muscle or smooth muscle or glandular tissue, right? Okay. So, so this very short sort of bundle here of both sensory information coming in and motor information coming out is a spinal nerve, right? And the spinal nerve is what we call a mixed nerve because it's carrying both sensory and motor information. This would, of course, be that's a sensory neuron within a sensory nerve. This is a motor neuron within a motor nerve, right? Again, there would be multiple axons in each of these. Okay. One other thing to point out, because I do want to make it continuous with what you've seen in brain anatomy, and again, you've probably seen this, but just in lab, well, online, hopefully, but is the fact that we have a system of membranes that surrounds the spinal cord, right? And those are called the meninges collectively. And the meninges are divided up into the innermost pia mater, PIA, next word, MATER, right? That's the one that's sort of shrink wrapped right onto the neural tissue. Then we have an arachnoid mater. And then outside of that, we have the very tough dura mater. Now, in the space between the arachnoid and the pia, there's a subarachnoid space that contains CSF. So there's actually cerebral spinal fluid circulating sort of in that sheath outside the spinal cord, as well as through that central canal. And again, that's continuous all the way up to the brain, those open spaces that contain and circulate cerebral spinal fluid. Okay. Now let's finish our picture here because we don't have a target cell, right? So we've got our stimulus coming in, right? It's a reflex. So a reflex, stimulus in, integration, right? Often very little motor output to control our target cell. Well, if this is a somatic reflex, like the withdrawal reflex I was talking about, again, we'll talk more about a couple specific reflexes in another video. But that's going to mean that our target here is skeletal muscle. A little bit like a muscle. Right? And so it would be, this motor neuron would be synapsing with and releasing neurotransmitter at synapses on individual skeletal muscle cells within that muscle, right? So I'm just drawing the whole muscle, but it would be synapsing on individual. And actually, at the end here, what would happen would be this guy would branch and generate multiple synapses on this muscle. And again, we'll talk about that later when we get to control of skeletal muscle. When we talk about skeletal muscle, right? But we get innervation of multiple cells here. And again, it can be a fairly small number, 5 to 10, but it can be upwards of 1,000. So again, we can have a lot of splitting of this axon at its target tissue here to innervate a whole bunch of cells. Okay, so again, let's follow through the whole process here. Stimulus, right? Graded potential at the quote-unquote dendrites, the nerve endings. Action potential generation, as long as we reach threshold of the voltage-gated channels. And nerve impulse is the traveling action potential, the regeneration of an action potential. Action potentials per se don't travel, they just get regenerated at each segment. And so the regeneration of action potentials is a nerve impulse. More neurotransmitter, right? And so put some neurotransmitter molecules, probably can't see them, right? We again have, as long as this is stimulatory, in this scenario it is, EPSP generation on the dendrites and soma of that cell, action potential, right, reach threshold, action potential, more neurotransmitter release, right, we've been here before, more EPSPs on the motor neuron, and then action potential, i.e. nerve impulse traveling down to here, right, so it's kind of like a repeating of the steps in several locations. Now again, a lot of times it's not just sort of like, well, why not just have one neuron that sort of does all this? Well, it does. Multiple neurons allows us to do things with the information along the way, one of which would be something like this, where the interneuron could actually branch off and then have an axon that runs through the white matter tracts and runs north to the brain, right? And so you put your hand on something hot or something sharp, yes, you reflexively pull your hand off of it, but you also become aware, right? You yell, ow, and you're like, man, that really hurt, right? And you become consciously aware that you did it. And the consciousness is up here in the brain, or generated in the brain. And so we have to have divergence, right, of neural pathways to process it in more than one way. Okay. I think we're good with most of the spinal cord nerve anatomy. What I want to talk about now is, one thing I do want to point out is that notice that this axon actually crossed over to the other side, right? And what that means is that sensory information from the right side of your body is actually received and processed by the left side of your brain, right? And so, and actually motor information, generation of motor output, like when you think about moving your arm as opposed to this sort of reflexive component, is the same way, right? In other words, the left side of your brain controls the right side of your body. That crossover is called decussation. Don't worry too much about that term, but we do have this sort of odd sort of crossing over between left and right. And again, usually, not always. There's some places where things remain on the same side. Okay, but I think we're good with the general idea here. What I want to do now is I want to categorize reflexes, which will really help us sort of like summarize the variety, I think, of reflex anatomy and function and that sort of thing. And so I'll squeeze that in down here. And we'll call this reflex categories, I guess. Okay. And the first one I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of group these a bit. The first one is innate versus acquired. All right, so I'm going to bundle these a little bit. I'm sorry if this is a little small. I want to try to get them all in. I've got a few of them to cover here. And so this is sort of like, are you born with them versus are they something that develops with time and with exposure to a stimulus? So innate reflexes are things that you're born with. So suckling is a very it's a reflex that you're born with. Blinking, right? You touch the eyelashes of an infant, they will reflexively blink. Pain withdrawal reflexes are innate; those are you're born with those. Others are acquired. They tend to be a little bit more, at least the skeletal motor ones tend to be a little bit more complex. Think about the first time you rode a bicycle, right? It might not have gone very well, or a skateboard, or been on ice skates, or something like that, right? But over time, right, you learn to balance, and it got less awkward, essentially. Those are acquired reflexes. That's sort of adjustments that are made reflexively, but you don't have them when you first do a particular motor activity, right? And so that's the difference between innate and acquired. Sort of an anatomical difference is, we've already mentioned this, spinal versus cranial, right? So this was obviously a spinal reflex. They can also be cranial in origin, in which case the information is coming into and out of the brainstem, and the processing is occurring at that level. Let's go to, and again, I think we've said this already, somatic versus visceral. Right? This is a somatic reflex, right? Because we're controlling skeletal muscle. Visceral reflexes are controlling the viscera, right? Or your visceral targets through the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic is also known as visceral motor, right? And so if we're controlling a visceral target, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle in a zillion different locations, blood vessel, respiratory tract, digestive tract, reproductive tract, all those places, glandular targets, right? That would all be visceral motor. And there are reflexes associated with that. You reflexively adjust your heart rate based upon receiving information about your blood pressure, right? That's a visceral reflex arc. We can go with a little bit more anatomical. What I've got here is this sort of, you can have a monosynaptic reflex or a polysynaptic reflex. Well, this is a what I've shown you here so far is a polysynaptic reflex because there is two synapses within this reflex arc. So poly is anything more than one. There is really only one monosynaptic reflex, which is the stretch reflex. And again, I'll talk about that particular reflex in a subsequent video. But it's a way to anatomically describe the reflex arc by the number of synapses. Let's see, I'm trying to keep track of my order here. Okay, they can be ipsilateral or contralateral. Sometimes reflexes have more than one component. So let's do a withdrawal reflex, but have it be in your legs instead of your arms, right? And so in this scenario, the withdrawal, let's just say you stepped on something sharp, right? You would hop up off that foot, right? That would be the initial reflexive response, would be to yank your foot up. Again, skeletal muscle contraction, you yank your foot up. That is on the same side. In other words, you got the pain on, let's say, your left foot, you're going to hop up off your left foot, right? Same side means ipsilateral. The same time that's happening, all of a sudden, your body weight went from being sort of balance between both your both your legs, and all of a sudden you're going to have to like stabilize your opposite leg, right? That would be a contralateral reflex. That's stabilization on the opposite side of the body. In other words, we'd have to have a branching here in their interneuron come over to the other side, right, and innervate motor neurons that go to the opposite side limb to make sure that we don't fall down right after we step on something sharp on our left foot, right? And so that's contralateral, opposite side. And I think I had one more. What was it? If it's spinal, I don't have to really draw a separate one here. I'll sort of put a little Y off of the spinal. And again, this is just, I'm not trying to make things more and more complex, but I want to give you examples that are actually everyday kind of examples that you're probably familiar with. And so with spinal, spinal. These arrows are coming off this term spinal. And they can be monosegmental or polysegmental. And if you recall, if you think about it, right, the spinal cord, what it contains, the neurons it's containing, especially in the gray matter. Yes, the ascending, descending white matter components are running up and down from, up above and down below. But the gray matter tracks, right? This processing is occurring at a particular section, right? We cut at one spot. If we go up or down, we would be looking at neurons that are innervating different targets, right? And so if information comes in at, let's say, the brachial plexus is a network of nerves in the shoulder that innervate the arm. And so if that information is coming in from your hand, right, you touch something hot, you need that information to go out to your arm so you can pull that particular limb back from the painful stimulus. Well, in that scenario, it would be monosegmental. It would be coming in and going out of the exact same region of the spinal cord. If it's polysegmental, right, the example I always give here is I run everywhere I go. And I'm pretty clumsy. And so probably about once every 2 months, I like trip and stumble down the steps because I'm running too fast. And as you sort of start to fall or you slip on the steps, right, you're trying to maintain your balance. You're not thinking about any of this, right? You're thinking, right? You're trying, quote unquote, unconsciously to maintain your balance. Is that just coming in, information just coming in and out of one segment of the spinal cord? Of course not, right? Your arms are flailing, right? Your torso is sort of twisting. Your feet are trying to, find a place to balance again. And so information is sort of coming up and down the spinal cord and popping out at different regions. I call that a polysegmental because it's involving more than one portion of the spinal cord. Okay, I think that's plenty on both the general anatomy of a spinal reflex and then how we might categorize them, showing a little bit more complexity than we actually showed with this one example. We'll be back later for a video on specific, again, a couple of specific spinal reflexes, just to give us a feel for how these things function and what their purpose might be.